Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Online National Marxist School, sponsored by the Education Commission of CPUSA. My name is Duncan. I am the chair of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee of the Peace and Solidarity Commission. And I'll start with a brief introduction here. Tonight's class on China is entitled China from Feudal Dynasties and Century of Humiliation to Socialist Modernization. Tonight's class is in 3 parts. First, I will give a PowerPoint on some important points in Chinese history, especially those that have impact today. Second, we will hear from Emily, a Chinese-American comrade who is currently working and studying in Beijing. She will present a PowerPoint on the People's Republic of China and socialist modernization. We hope you will join us for the last 2 classes this Saturday, June 10th, beginning at 11 a.m. That's Eastern Time. After the presentations, there will be a question and answer session. Some information about me. I got interested in China as an anti-war activist in the 1960s. My first trip to China was with the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association in 1981. During the 1980s, I helped organize exchanges to and from China and served as editor of U.S.-China Review. This century, I coordinated the China Study Group at the Center for Marxist Education in Cambridge, and I last visited China in 2017. I've had articles published in People's World and Red World Review, as well as Portside and other places. I am eager to go back now that things are opening up after COVID. We want to approach the class with an open mind on a learning curve. Knowledge about China and Chinese civilization is not very good, either in the U.S. general public or on the left. We have a lot to learn. There are different views on the vast country of China, and that is understandable. Naturally, people have opinions, but be cautious about making judgments. Study the Chinese press as well as Western sources for balance in both sides of the story. So, now let us start the PowerPoint. If you want to understand socialism with Chinese characteristics, you can start by knowing something about Chinese characteristics. That is, a few basic facts about Chinese history and culture. This is essential. So what are some Chinese characteristics? Now let me say that these are my own interpretations as a Westerner who has studied China in different ways over the last 50 years. The Chinese themselves will probably agree with some of these points of history, but also have a different take. Now our slide here, this is the Yellow Emperor. Chinese civilization is old, about 5,000 years, and is special in part due to its remarkable continuity. This enables a connection between the ancient and the modern. The mythological Yellow Emperor is a progenitor of the Chinese Han people, more of a person than a god. He brought many good things to the people, including the technologies of civilization. Almost as old as the Yellow Emperor is the book I Ching, in which the ancient Chinese seers and priests used the notation of yin and yang, broken and solid lines in their dialectical cosmology, their attempt to understand the world and divine the future. Leibniz, the 17th century German mathematician who developed binary mathematics, the basis of the digital revolution, observed that his notation of 0 and 1 was the same as the ancient Chinese broken and solid lines. This was a proto-scientific method, of course. The ancients didn't know modern scientific laws. The point is that Chinese civilization has long shown great interest and accomplishment in science and technology. So here's a kind of a comparison. This shows some historic Chinese innovations in technology, some of the world's most important. On the right, you can see some sectors where China is advancing today. The people's government resources, high-tech development programs, not to take over the world for some nefarious goal, but simply returning to the traditional pursuits and China's place as one of the world's advanced civilizations. So here we have a picture of Confucius. Confucianism is focused on human relationships in the family and in society, and also on ethics. There is a 2,500-year-old literature of humanism in China. While Confucianism's patriarchal values are outdated and must be discarded, current slogans such as people-centered development and shared future for humanity are concepts with deep roots in Chinese culture. China regards the success and poverty alleviation to be a major accomplishment in human rights. Keep China's humanist tradition in mind when discussing human rights. So now we're going to move on to the dynasties. China was unified by Qin Shi Huang, 221 BC. And the subsequent Han Dynasty, roughly concurrent with the Roman Empire, was similar in size and power. China at that time traded with Rome. The Qin Dynasty also standardized weights and measures, currency, and the legal system, built a Great Wall, and introduced a uniform script for writing. So when I was in school, in Ohio, I learned all about the Roman Empire, but they didn't tell me about the Qing Dynasty. And here we want to make the point that agriculture has been the basis of the Chinese economy for the next 2,000 years. And China, of course, also had very high quality commodities such as silk. These are women silk workers, porcelain, and other goods very, very desired in Europe and other places. And so China traded with Rome, and here you can see this is a map of some of the routes of the Silk Road, of the ancient Silk Road. And it's interesting that many of these routes are the same as what's being developed today in terms of the infrastructure development, pipelines, and so forth, in the Belt and Road Initiative. So for those of you interested in reclaiming some women's history, you might want to study Wu Zetian, who was one of the most important rulers of China. She was empress during the Tang Dynasty for 30 or 40 years. She started as a 14-year-old concubine sent to the imperial court for the pleasure of the emperor. And later she became empress and is generally regarded as one of the most successful and accomplished of the China's rulers. And here you have the map of the Tang Dynasty. You can see on the left, that's Xinjiang. So you can see that was part of China at this time. Buddhism also came into China, hundreds of millions of practitioners. Here you can see some of the architecture of the Tibetan Buddhists, and also a mosque in Yangzhou. Genghis Khan conquered China. The Mongols conquered China. Kublai Khan hosted Marco Polo. You probably heard about that. Again, the Silk Road, very important at this time. And this is, I find interesting, in the early 15th century. These are the voyages of discovery of the early Ming Dynasty, which is about a generation ahead of the Portuguese in terms of sailing to Africa. And the Chinese at this time also technologically very developed in terms of their long distance ships and so forth. So the interesting thing to think about was these long distance explorations were ended by decree of a later Ming emperor. What if they had continued? World history might have been quite a bit different. And so now we're jumping over into the 18th century. And here you have the Qing Dynasty. And just to make the point, 1776, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he cited China as one of the wealthiest places on earth. So that's where China was in 1776. However, that changed. as China traded more and more with the West, Europe at that time imported large quantities of Chinese goods, but did not sell very much to China. There's a huge imbalance of trade. The British were very concerned that all their silver and gold was going to China. So they came up with opium as something they could export into China, addict the Chinese, balance the trade. But the Chinese eventually declared opium illegal. And so the British launched the Opium War to force to take the Chinese were forced to import opium. And this was just the first of many of the colonial powers invading China or forcing concessions one way or another. This led to one reason for a huge civil war, which you don't hear much about, roughly contemporary to the US Civil War, only it was longer, much bigger, and much bloodier. And it had a sort of democratic aspect of rising up against the Qing. They're called the Taiping Rebellion. Switching over to the US, you can see at this time is when Chinese immigrants came and helped build the Transcontinental Railway, among other things, the mines and so forth. However, they were eventually unwelcomed, and the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, and there was a lot of racism and lynchings and so forth. That's a very important part of history that's not talked about that much. Japanese invaded in 1890s, defeated China, annexed Taiwan. Later on, there was a major Japanese fascist invasion in the 1930s and 1940s. Some 20 million Chinese lost their lives fighting fascism. We jump to, go to the revolution of 1911. The workers rose up and overthrew the Qing dynasty and established what proved to be a rather, at first, weak republic. But the dynasties were ended. 1911, by the working class. This is an interesting kind of contemporary picture of a women's military unit attacking the imperial forces. And other interesting women in the Chinese Revolution. Chu Jin was a martyr, early feminist. Sun Qing-ling, influential supporter of many revolutionary causes. She was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, leader of the 1911 revolution. She was, I consider her an early founder of the People's Friendship Movement. In 1919, the Versailles Treaty discriminated against China, handed Germany's concessions over to Japan, even though China fought with the Allies. This caused a major protest in China, and May 4th movement, it's called, anti-imperialist, major anti-imperialist movement, calling for a revolution in culture, modern science, modern democracy, and so forth. And here this was in many ways a student-led movement. Here the students are welcoming a victory. And the Russian Revolution shortly thereafter impacted China, and China founded the Communist Party. There's only about 15, 16 people in the original meeting in Shanghai, including Mao, of course. But the party did very well. It was growing very rapidly, so the reactionaries double-crossed the Communist Party in 1927 and launched a tremendously brutal massacre of all party members and leftists and trade unions and feminists, et cetera, they could find. It's almost destroyed the party, embarked on the Long March, which is a big strategic retreat to the safe areas in the Northwest. There's a lot of sort of romantic kind of stories about the Long March, which are certainly deserved. It's an amazing saga. But we should also see that for many of the marchers, it was grueling, and actually majority of the Long Marchers never made it. They were either killed, died, left, whatever. But the Long March helped establish the base areas in Yunnan and northwest China. Here's where I think in a lot of ways where socialism with Chinese characteristics was first really developed and elaborated. And here there was a major forum, Literature of Art, that was held in Yunnan. And at this time, the US and China were allies during World War II, fighting the Japanese fascists. And there was a lot of collaboration between the US and China at that time, and particularly also the US and the Communist Party led Red Army. That US military were dispatched to China, and you can see some of them talking to Mao. There are a lot of friendships and good feelings were built up at this time when the US and China are allies, and China today is trying to reach back to these roots. And the Friendship Association is trying to reach back to these roots to improve relations. Here you can see the Civil War. Those red areas in the north, that's the Red Army area, moving south. Eventually, Mao's armies, Juda's armies, won throughout China, and Chiang Kai-shek and the reactionary Kuomintang retreated to Taiwan, which is that green island you can see in southeast part of China. And on October 1st, 1949, here you have Chairman Mao proclaiming the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Shortly thereafter, the Korean War broke out. US and China became enemies. Hidden History of the Korean War there's just been an updated version of this book put out, which gives you a much more objective account of what actually happened during the Korean War, as opposed to the propaganda that one learns in school, or at least in most schools. And at this time, this is when the U.S. sent its 7th Naval Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to protect Chiang Kai-shek's anti-communist government on Taiwan. And this is the beginning. That act is the beginning of the whole Taiwan issue. There's no such thing as, independent Taiwan or anything like that prior to this action by U.S. imperialism. So you have, of course, the Yellow Peril in the 1950s, the McCarthy period, Chinese spies everywhere, Cold War repression. And unfortunately, with the revival of Cold War today by the U.S. and its allies, you can see the return of some of this racist type stereotyping and anti-China feeling. Now, Zhou Enlai, upon founding the People's Republic of China, envisioned a modern socialist China, peaceful coexistence, anti-war, and particularly working with the countries of what they called the non-aligned movement at that time, the ex-colonies, the newly independent countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Was also a focus of Chinese policy in the 1950s, along with working with the Soviet Union. And here you can see the rapprochement with the U.S. in 1971, 72, that period. So what are some lessons of history? China was a self-described semi-colonial, semi-feudal country in 1949. That is, the production forces were mostly backward, agriculture, mostly using feudal technology. So it's important to understand that the People's Republic began socialist construction in a country largely impoverished, poor, and undeveloped. China has this in common with many ex-colonies in developing countries in the Third World or Global South. China's program for advanced science and technology is not for world hegemony or to dominate the U.S., Rather, from the time of the Yellow Emperor, Chinese culture and civilization has always been very interested in pushing technological innovation. So, my feeling is that China will match the West in most areas of science and technology. The West may retain dominance in some sectors, but China almost certainly push beyond the West in other areas and set the world standard. And this is what imperialism is most afraid of. So the US should not be trying to block China's rise. It's not going to work. You can throw down some obstacles in front of, Huawei and TikTok and so forth, but that's not going to stop the huge trend of China modernizing. So we should be cooperating for mutual benefit, for peace, for dealing with climate change, pandemics, and so forth. So if we had time or some other point, we could talk about some of the actions that we can take. So here's my final slide, serve the people. That summarizes a lot about socialist China. So thank you for listening. And I now want to turn things over to Emily, who's going to deal with a different history and issues concerning the socialist construction in the People's Republic.
Well, thank you, Duncan. It is a great honor for me as a Chinese American to be here to talk about the history of the land of my ancestors. My name is Emily, and I'm a member of the CPUSA's Peace and Solidarity Commission. I currently work in Beijing as a biologist. I was born in the US, but I spent part of my childhood in China, took a major part of my education there as well. So I reckon I have a pretty good access to the history of the CPC and New China from a different perspective than most, especially recent history, which is part of my lived experience. So today I will go over the modern part of Chinese history, particularly how the CPC builded and modernized socialist New China after its founding. So particularly, I want to illustrate how did China go from a major agricultural and backwardly developed country from here to here in a matter of 70-ish years. I hope by illustrating the process of China's modernization, I could show that it is possible for the working class everywhere to achieve such transformations, and that we could learn from China and work alongside China for a better reality. So here will be the structure of my talk today. I will break down the history post-1949 to 4 parts. First, the founding of the PRC and the socialist system. Second, the socialist development, the explorations and the setbacks. And third, the socialists with Chinese characteristics that we know of, the SWCC. And finally, I will talk about the SWCC in the new era, which is now our time. So let's turn our time back to October 1949. The revolution is won. The CPC kicked the KMT out of most parts of China, save a few. The Mao Zedong stood on the Tiananmen Square, stood on the building, pressed the big communism button, and announced that the Chinese people have stood up. New China is here. But now what? Let's take a look at the shambles China was in back then. So of course, first of all, not all parts of China has been liberated back then, notably Xinjiang, Tibet's part of the south, and don't forget the island of Taiwan. And speaking of Taiwan, sure, the Kuomintang left, but in its last years of rule in the mainland, it basically screwed up the economy so bad, created huge inflations, and when they fled to Taiwan, they took most of the gold reserve of China with them. The productive forces shriveled because of years of wars and economic turmoil, and the market was filled with inflation and rampant speculation. And aside from that, China didn't have much else left either. The infrastructure was also wrecked by war, development was halted, and that is a lasting result of the 100 years of shame. And while the working people embraced socialism wholeheartedly, the remnants of the old social order still dwell in all corners of the society. And on the outside, there was danger as well. The US made allies with the Kuomintang on Taiwan, trying to launch a counterattack to take over the mainland again. The US and the UN army was also threatening China in the north with their intervention in Korea. So it's basically a dangerous time all around. CPC has to not only finish the liberation, but also build a socialist system, not just in name, but in all aspects from the ground up that can sustain and defend itself. So let's think about the whole socialist modernization as a long quest in a game or something, but it has to be divided into little quest objectives. And the quest objective at this time is very clear. First, we need to make a socialist system from ground zero. In order to do that, the country must first have a socialist political system that includes the legislative bodies, the different levels of government from central to local, and changing the old laws that reflect feudal and capitalist interests into new ones that reflects progressive working class values. So that's what the CPC did. On its way to liberate places like Xinjiang and Tibet, they did their best to earn the trust of the indigenous people. There were also stories of CPC cadres who went to the indigenous tribes in Yunnan and did blood oaths with them to earn their trust. The CPC solved the national question of the ethnic minorities by establishing different levels of autonomous regions, autonomous counties, and so on, and make sure that indigenous people rule these districts in majority. For legislative bodies, the CPC established the People's Congress, and they continue to meet to this day. The CPC also established a series of progressive laws, the first being marriage law, which worked to uproot feudal practices that oppressed vulnerable populations for hundreds, if not thousands of years, which is a huge undertaking. In order to counter external pressure, China worked on two fronts. First, to combat imperialist advances, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army went into Korea and fought valiantly, earning the ceasefire in Korea that is there today. It also worked on peace and solidarity with the so-called Third World, as Duncan had just mentioned, especially with the newly liberated Asian and African countries in Latin America, and so on. China supported the self-determination of indigenous nations and came up with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. These principles continue to guide China's diplomatic works to this day. And of course, being a materialist, we know that a country should also have a working economic system in order to sustain and develop. In China's case, this also includes the brand new task of making a socialist economy. So the first step, as we might imagine, is to confiscate the capital of bureaucrat capitalists and turn them into state assets. However, this is not as simple as taking all the capitalists, put them to the wall once the big communist button is pressed. There were many progressive capitalists who supported the new democratic revolution, and these people's capital were turned into public-private joint businesses through negotiations. So all of these are part of the Marxist and Leninist transformation of the national economy. The CPC's economists also work to stabilize prices, fight against speculations, and unify state financial and economic works. All of these were in line with the Marxist-Leninist view of socialist economy, and we can find many similarities to Lenin's economic plans as well. So as I mentioned, China's productive forces were very, very underdeveloped. So the CPC established a series of plans in 5-year units. So these 5-year plans continue to be implemented and completed to this day, with a couple of years of halt in between, but there have been several, there have been dozens of 5-year plans. The first 5-year plans officially launched the process of socialist industrialization, focusing on what China didn't really have then, which is heavy industry. So in this very first 5-year period, China was able to make their first cars on their own and build a lot of infrastructure such as roads and bridges, even in places with very bad natural environments, such as the Qinghai-Tibet road. At the time, China's economic system was, using Mao's own words, state capitalism. That's right, he used that phrase. But although he used that in Lenin's sense, which is the state will place orders on private enterprises, and the private enterprises were not allowed to freely expand their capital and market share. Also, the CPC expanded joint public-private operations of enterprises, and the small handicraft productions were put into cooperatives as well. And agricultures are, on the front of agriculture, there were the agricultural cooperative movement. So by the year of 1946, these so-called beginner's quests were declared complete, and New China was officially transformed into a socialist state. Here are some pictures depicting events from that era. You can see this is the first car made in the PRC. This is the Qinghai-Tibet Highway, which is built in like snowy plateau. And Zhou Enlai at the Bandung Conference, and this is the meeting of the first National People's Congress. So now China has transformed into a socialist state, but it still needs to grow. And this is usually when an already existing socialist country run into some difficulties, because each country starts with a different hand of cards, so to speak. One must evaluate their own situations and adapt Marxism-Leninism based on their own situation. And this also marks the so-called classical Mao era. So the CPC, of course, studied itself, and what its major pressure point is. The concept of principal contradiction was lifted from Marxism-Leninism, but here in the context of China, it is slightly different, more material and concrete, you could say. It means that the principal conflict pressure point between two opposing forces or factors that hang over the nation and the masses. So before 1949, the principal contradiction was that between imperialism and the Chinese nation, and that between feudalism and the oppressed masses. Now, at the turn of 1956, the CPC determined that the principal contradictions are: one, the contradiction between underdeveloped agricultural countries and developed industrial countries; two, the contradiction between the people's growing material and cultural need and underdeveloped social production. Do remember this last part of the sentence, because we will encounter it later. So, now when we think of the classical Mao era, for good or bad, we might think about this. However, this is also a time of remarkable development in industry, technology, and science, well, with a big dose of that as well. So what essentially happened in this era was that after some practices, the CPC, who once was following the Soviet recipe of socialism, they determined that the Soviet path, particularly the economic model, did not suit China's condition very well, thus China must seek its own path towards a great socialist industrialized country. The key idea here is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to socialist modernization, because each country have a different material basis. Notice that this is also the essence of the socialists with Chinese characteristics to come. This is a long-standing tradition in the CPC. Remember, as I said, the CPC functions in continuums. There is no huge cutoffs between the leaderships. They all follow the same Chinese communist tradition. So naturally, because the CPC is figuring out its own way, this led to some setbacks. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were both attempts to carve out a Chinese way to modernize and develop socialism faster, either on the material front or on the ideological front. But they fell on idealism and they failed. And the CPC admits that in their own words. But besides that, the CPC also led China to a great deal of accomplishments during this time. When people talk about the Mao era, they tend to focus on the flashy events, for good or bad. But we as communists, we should look at things materially and comprehensively. So what are those? In fact, one of the key strategies that carried on even into the 80s was formally introduced during this time, which is the 4 modernizations. The 4 modernization was brought up by Mao Zedong in the 50s, and it was introduced by Zhou Enlai to the National Congress in 1964. This strategy pointed out where China should focus on developing. As the rehabilitation of economy has been done in 56, this corresponds to the principal contradiction between the underdeveloped agricultural countries and the developed industrial countries. So the idea in its original form was phased out after a few decades, as China already is somewhat modernized, but the emphasis on development of socialism would be present and developed and expanded in all coming strategies. So the 4 modernizations are industry, agriculture, science and technology, and national defense. So let's look at what accomplishments China achieved during this time on these modernizations. So first, I must dispel a lie that has been promoted by counter-revolutionaries a lot. Socialism is not tied to famine. Sure, in the early 50s, there have been a series of natural disasters, and China experienced some famines in some places, but after this one time, China achieved food security despite being under double sanctions from both the Eastern and Western Bloc. On industry, China developed a lot of technologies, for example, nukes and the artificial satellite, which greatly dispelled the nuclear threats from imperialist powers. China also seeks to expand its energy security by discovering and developing oil fields in Daqing. And in education and science, Chinese scientists successfully synthesized bovine insulin, which is a world first. They could have even claimed a Nobel Prize, but because the Nobel Prize was given to a few individuals, but this is a collective effort, not an individual one, so they didn't even participate. And illiteracy, which was very common in rural China, in poor areas, was being steadily eliminated. This is no easy task. Look at how hard the Chinese language is. Healthcare was also greatly developed during this time, as healthcare was made more accessible in rural areas. Hygiene and epidemic prevention were also an emphasis. This was originally introduced as a national movement to combat imperialist threats of biowarfare, which was heightened during the Korean War, and the spirit continued into this era. So now we can see that despite some setbacks, socialist China was still developing and achieved a lot during this turbulent time. This is because of CPC's leadership, not despite of it. But now we must also admit that at the turn of the late 70s, early 80s, China was kind of closed off and could have developed faster. This led to a great realization of the CPC and the more familiar so-called Deng era, and the formal introduction of the socialists with Chinese characteristics. And to some, it is like a more familiar history as well. So in 1981, the CPC identified that the primary contradiction of the time as the contradiction between the people's growing material need and cultural needs and the underdeveloped social production. At the time, while China can sustain itself in agriculture and light industry, the quality of life is generally lacking. The total social production is also lagging behind. Well, to put it bluntly, compared to other countries, especially the more developed countries, China's social production was like a cupcake compared to an 8-inch cake. No matter how fair you distribute a cupcake, it's still just a cupcake and no one is truly satisfied. So this kind of socialism doesn't seem too greatly advantageous compared to capitalism, even when capitalist societies are racked with oppression and unjust distribution. It's just hard to combat capitalism when you don't have material advantages over capitalism. And as Deng famously said, poverty should not be a quality of socialism. China wanted a well-developed socialism, and a socialism that has advantages over capitalism. In order to do that, China must make the proverbial cake bigger, and it's very urgent. Such a change in course after 10 years of chaos would naturally lead to a lot of ideological confusions. Some people might even try to co-opt this change and try to destroy China's revolutionary legacy and dissolve the socialist leadership and so on. The CPC foresaw that and made special effort to emphasize that they must keep to the socialist road. What people don't usually discuss is that a lot of ideological struggles happened during that time. And in the end, it was concentrated into 4 cardinal principles, which are keeping to the socialist ideology and politics, upholding the dictatorship of the proletariat, upholding the leadership of the CPC, and upholding Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. Also, the public sector economy was determined that must be maintained as the majority, but although diverse forms of economy are also encouraged. So with that as the basis, the goal was clear. China must develop social production, and quickly as well. In order to not make huge mistakes again, the CPC began to do small-scale trials in a few places before implementing strategies nationwide. This is true for both the agricultural reform and opening up markets. Places like Shenzhen and Hainan are established as special zones where open trade are being tested, then gradually introduced to the rest of the country. Private and collective businesses were encouraged to be established. Foreign investments were allowed to happen, although foreign investment has to be like a joint investment with a Chinese business, and laws must be abided by, yada yada. All of these measures greatly increased the overall incentive to develop social production, and the result is kind of well-known history. On the cultural front, more diverse expression was encouraged, and a lot of foreign arts and movies were imported. Local art, music, and literature flourished. Entertainment industries advanced, and all of that. But well, with the opening up of market, naturally come the establishing of foreign relations. This also includes repairing relations with the Eastern Bloc countries as well, and of course, establishing a relation with the U.S. and the West. Also, since opening up the market naturally means getting exposed to foreign, especially bourgeois liberal influences, the imperialists saw that and tried to instigate some color revolutions in order to overthrow the CPC like they did the USSR. The CPC had to thwart a few color revolution attempts, which they did successfully, etc. So some of these pictures are really heartwarming to see because a lot of them happened during my lifetime, which maybe some of your lifetimes as well. Deng Xiaoping writing on the success of Shenzhen, China joining the WTO, Hong Kong returns, Macau returns as well, Beijing Olympics, which continues to marvel people today. Those are all of the pretty well-known accomplishments of China back then. So I will not dwell on the so-called past 40 years for too much because, well, that is pretty well known. Instead, I want to spend a bit more time on what China today is focusing on, how they plan to move forward, which we are in our current movement. So let's fast forward to 2017. In the 19th National Congress of the CPC, they identified the principal contradiction of the time as the contradiction between the people's growing material and cultural needs and the uneven and unthorough development of social production. Note the change from underdeveloped to uneven and unthorough development. So the proverbial cake is big enough now. The CPC recognized that it is time to divide the cake in a better way. So see, the CPC knows full well that with market and allowing capitalist economy to happen in China, it comes with drawbacks, and they're focusing on dealing with it. These drawbacks have part of its roots in China's long feudal history and remnants of the hundreds of years of shame. When the market is opened up and capital is allowed to exist, the remnants of feudalism, bureaucrat capitalism, and colonialism, the so-called three big mountains, also got a little bit of a breather, and they banded together to try and get more interest for their own. And since China is in a global market right now, also inevitably, the imperialist West that dominated this market tried to enforce its own design on China. They want China to stay as a world factory on the lower end of the global production chain, which China does not want to be. And when they realized that China doesn't want to stay like that, nor could they overthrow China through color revolution, they began to use force with their blockade, containment efforts, and threats of war, which leads to the so-called Cold War 2.0 that we are experiencing today. All of these are challenges China is tackling. Now, just last year, we saw the CPC's 20th National Congress, which fully detailed their recent work and near future plans for a better socialist China. This includes achieving small common prosperity, which include eliminating poverty, concerted efforts on all fronts of social development, which includes institutional reforms, socialist ideology, democracy, self-governance of the party, etc. Overcoming key obstacles in industry and technology to thwart the imperialist stress, and combating imperialist stress through rejuvenating the people's military forces and building foreign relations, promoting international trade, promoting global peace, and so on. Now, let's talk about some of these focuses in detail. These are aspects that I think we as Western comrades could really learn from China's experience or cooperate with China on. So, starting from 2015, the CPC began to tackle one of the hardest remnants of underdevelopment, the last bastion of poverty, which are poor counties that have such suboptimal conditions that it's hard for them to have any motivation to modernize. We all know backwater places like that. They occur all over the world and in the United States as well. So to combat poverty in these places, CPC sent cadres and experts to these counties to help with local governance, developing economic strategies, introducing technologies, encouraging education, etc., etc. Many of them dedicated their prime years to these places. Some even lost their lives. Picture here on the bottom right is a young comrade who worked very hard in her county as a CPC cadre, and she lost her life due to a car accident on her commute to the village, and she is recognized as a martyr. Very recently, there is a biopic made about her. What is special about this new wave of poverty alleviation measures is that it is both targeted and concerted. The state allocated resources and designed strategies for these places according to each region's conditions and needs, and all possible sectors of the society, from the government to local businesses, even to the military, contributed to lifting these counties out of poverty. For example, the expert would study the region and figure out what economic crops are best fit to grow there, such as fruits or nuts. The cadres would help the local government to roll the plan out, persuade the people to cooperate, persuade the people to send their kids to school, etc. Agronomy experts will teach the people how to grow things better. Local businesses will try to promote and buy these products. More developed provinces, such as Jiangsu and Shanghai, will direct resources to underdeveloped provinces. And the PLA may even help with infrastructures, disaster relief, and day-to-day life problems. So it's like a whole concerted effort. As a Chinese saying goes, the whole nation is a game of chess, so everything must happen concertedly. So by February 25th, 2021, it was declared that all 832 poor counties were lifted out of abject poverty. This is something unprecedented in the thousands of years of Chinese history. And of course, with the heightened global situation, China is doing their part to save the collective humanity from capitalist destruction as well. So you've probably heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. It is called an initiative because it is not coercive. Everyone must be willing to join. Through this initiative, China was able to introduce their modernization experiences, such as building infrastructures, providing medical care and education to developing countries that are willing to modernize as China do. And saving the humanity isn't limited on human beings as well. China is leading in green technologies such as wind and solar power, and the electric cars as well. And is one of the leading countries in reforestation, the other being India. So look at that. We, as people in the developed countries, we can certainly do better. Politically, the CPC is also becoming more proactive internationally as the threat of imperialism and the new Cold War grows. They are more active in SolidNet now, and also initiated many meetings, workshops, and programs to communicate with international comrades. Just this March, the CPC brought forth one of its global initiatives, the Global Civilization Initiative, during a high-level meeting of global political parties, which the CPUSA also attended. The global initiatives are Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiatives. These initiatives promote the value of mutual respect, peace, communication, and common prosperity. And look here, this is one of our co-chairs, Comrade Rosanna, in a CPC workshop in Beijing. So now we're finally at the end of today's presentation. What I hope to be the take-home message is that the significance of Socialist China's quest for us is in the spirit of understanding our own characteristics. Adapting socialism to each society's characteristics is innate to dialectical materialism and is innate to all successful practices of existing socialist countries. Contradictions and main objectives will shift with time and place as well. So we as international comrades should also not be stagnant or idealistic. We should study our own characteristics and determine our own roads towards socialism and prosperity. We should also be steadfast in Marxism. As Xi Jinping said in the 20th National Congress, and I roughly translated, the CPC can, the SWCC is good. It's all because Marxism is good. Marxism works. And because the CPC stick to its promises, we can also look forward to China's future contents and what we can learn from them. Because by 2035, they'll complete the quest line of basic socialist modernization. And hopefully, we could all live to see the beautiful year of 2050, when China will become a truly awesome modern socialist power as they have planned. It will be strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, and beautiful. So these are my references. I try to use CPC literatures to be scientific. Thank you again for being here, and may we all convene in a beautiful socialist future for all mankind.